So I'm really happy to be here. I was so glad to get invited. I love giving talks like this. I am going to be here all week too, so if you think of questions or you want to talk after this, you can definitely find me some other time. So I'm also going to start with audience participation, although no colors are involved. So how many of you in this room are graduate students? Raise your hand. And how many of you are postdocs? And the rest of you, I assume, are neither. So how many of you are thinking of staying in a career in academia where you're going to be writing grants a lot? Great. Okay, good. So I'm going to start by depressing you because I'm very fun. So this is just some data from the NIH data book. I recently learned to remember to put QR codes in my talks, so if you click on that, you can get directed to the NIH data book. There's all kinds of information there about the NIH and what they fund and how they fund it. But this particular graph shows the number of applications that are submitted by and funded that are submitted by first-time contact PIs. So really people writing their first grants. The fiscal years are all on the bottom. So this is a lot of years. The dark blue lines are the number of applications that were submitted, and the light blue lines are the ones that were funded. And the success rate for first-time contact PIs is 19% last year. So that's not great, and it's really competitive, and I think that learning as much as you can about how the system works and how to write the grants most effectively can help you, get your best chance of getting your grant funded. So I also will admit that the federal government is not known for its clear and concise communication. I have worked at the NIH for 15 years. I still find a lot of it confusing, and I write the funding announcements, and they're not easy to get through, right? So it's not an easy process, and I'm hoping I can help you learn something about it here that will help you as you go forward in your career. So I've also put together this website at NHGRI for early stage and early career researchers. That QR code will take you to that website. There's a bunch of information on that site. Anything I find that I think would be helpful to people in this sort of career stage, I try to put there. I also recorded a video that goes through the NIH process in a lot more detail, and there's going to be some things in that I'm not going to cover today, so I would encourage you to go and watch that as well and see what you learn there. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about applying for a grant, 6 easy steps. Some of them are easier than others. The first one is figuring out what you want to do. So that's probably the most fun for you. I tell people it's a good idea to sort of start by sketching out sort of a rough idea of what specific aims you might put in a grant. So you probably have a lot of ideas about things that you want to do. In fact, you probably have an entire sort of career path worth of work that you've thought of. But you can't do that all in the context of one grant. So a good way to think about it is sort of identify sort of what is the larger problem that you're interested in solving, really critically identify whether anyone actually cares whether you solve that problem. We'll talk later about what reviewers are looking for in your grant applications, and that's really important. Has anybody else already solved this problem? And if they have, why is what you're going to do better or different? Can you actually do it? Or do you need other people to help you do it? And how much of it can you do in 5 years? How much can you actually do in 5 years? It's really common for people writing their first grants to be very overly ambitious and put a lot more in there than you can actually achieve. And then the next thing that you need to think about is who is going to fund you to do this? And so for that, it's really important to understand sort of how the NIH works. You may think of the NIH as sort of a big monolithic sort of entity you submit your grants to, but really the NIH is made up of 27 independent institutes and centers. They all have their own very specific scientific mission and scope, and they all work pretty much completely independently and differently. So it really is in your best interest to understand what institutes fund the kind of work that you do and how they work, sort of what is their pay line, how do they make funding decisions, what are their scientific priorities. And then also for people, especially who are doing things like developing technologies, using technologies that can be applied to many different questions, thinking about how what you do can be applied to answer the questions that other institutes are interested in. I have a favorite institute, it's NHGRI, but I would never want anybody to write all of their grants from NHGRI, because then you're really stuck with like what our funding situation is. It's really good to think about how you can diversify your sources of funding. So one way that you can figure out what institutes are interested in the kinds of questions that you are is by searching the NIH Reporter, and I hope you've looked at this before. It's a database of all of the NIH-funded grants. You can search it in a whole bunch of different ways. One of the ways is this matchmaker tool, so you can sort of paste in your specific aims there, and it will find other grants that have been funded that are sort of related to that. You can see what institutes funded those, what program officers are assigned to those. That'll help you know who you might talk to about it. And what other researchers have already been funded to do work like that. So that's something that's really helpful. There's a lot of great data in there. You could also then want to figure out how you're going to apply. So you apply through funding opportunity announcement. Actually, they're not called that anymore. They're called NOFOs, Notice of Funding Opportunity. It's going to take me 5 years before I remember to say NOFOs. But you can find those in the NIH guide. This link takes you to the NIH guide, and you can search that by keywords, or you can just browse all the funding opportunities that have been released recently. I also wanted to sort of walk you through the kinds of different funding announcements that you might see there. There are a couple of clues that will help you understand them a little bit better, how they work, what they're looking for. So the first kind of announcement that you might see are things that start with the letters PA. So that stands for program announcement. You may have heard people talk about like the parent announcement or the unsolicited grants. Those are sort of umbrella funding announcements that the NIH releases for different funding activity codes like R01, R21, et cetera. They don't have any specific topic. You can, whatever you woke up that morning and you wanted to write a grant about, you can generally write and apply through one of those. It's also important to know that there's not like specific funds set aside for those. Your grant application is going to go to a study section, get a score, and then it's going to compete with other applications by score that came to that institute, right? So that's basically all score-based. These get reviewed in what we call standing study sections. So those are sort of regularly meeting 3 times a year, somewhat consistent membership groups that are convened by a part of the NIH called the Center for Scientific Review. And they have standard due dates. So you can apply 3 times a year. There's very specific dates that you can apply, and it depends on what kind of grant you're planning to apply for. Then we have these ones that are called PAR. So a PAR is a program announcement with review. These can be a little bit more specific of a topic, and they also, it's important to know, don't have funds that are set aside for them. Just like for the program announcements, you get scored and you compete with all of the other grants that came in based on score. They do get reviewed in those same standing study sections, but they often have special review criteria that are specifically there to help grants in that kind of area. So NHGRI has one that's for computational genomics and data science, for example. And there are some very specific review criteria that have been added to that are helpful for people writing applications like that. And so those reviewers will also look at those, and they'll be using that as they come up with their scores for your application. And those can be either have standard or specific review dates. It'll be in the announcement. And then the last one is an RFA. That's a request for applications. So that's when an institute is telling you, like, we are really interested in this very specific topic, and we have a certain amount of money set aside that we're going to use to fund grants in this area. So when you apply through an RFA, you're only competing for those funds with the other people who applied for that RFA. Those are always reviewed in a special review panel. So only the applications that came in under that funding announcement will be reviewed in that study section. And they usually only have one receipt date a year, or maybe one receipt date ever, right? So they're very limited in terms of when you can apply for them. Okay, so those are the kinds of funding announcements that you might see. Next, we'll talk about some of the parts of a grant application and the kinds of things that you should be thinking about when you're writing those parts of the application. Some of the major parts of a grant application are the biosketches, the budget, the specific aims, the research strategy. You might have letters of support, and then a bunch of plans, right? That's things like the data management and sharing plan, human subjects stuff. I'm not going to talk about those today, but if you follow that QR code, that'll take you to a website that has a lot of information about writing data management and sharing plans, including like sample plans that would be helpful for you, I think, when you're putting together your own. So I'm really going to only talk about these 4 parts today. The first thing that's really important for you to think about when you're writing your grant application is that you're writing it for the reviewers. Like, unless you have the money yourself and you're planning to fund the research yourself, that's who you need to convince. And in order to do that, I think it's helpful to sort of understand how the review panel works and really what's going on in there. So basically what happens is you submit your application to the NIH. It gets assigned to one of the institutes. It gets assigned to a study section. Before the study section meets, they send your application out to usually three of the people on the study section, reviewer 1, 2, and 3. They read it, before the meeting, they give an initial score to it, and then they use those initial scores to rank all of the applications that are being discussed in that study section. So the top half of applications will get discussed further at the meeting, and then the bottom half of applications will not. You'll still get your critiques, the written critiques, but you won't get that sort of summary of discussion that tells you what they talked about. Sometimes people will pull out applications from that pile, so maybe like one reviewer thought it was the best thing that they ever read, and 2 reviewers didn't, and that one reviewer can say, oh, I would like to discuss this one. So you might sometimes get discussed in that. And then in the meeting, what happens is the 3 assigned reviewers will give sort of their preliminary score. They'll talk about your application, what they saw as the strengths and weaknesses. They'll take questions from everybody else on the panel. They will restate their scores. Sometimes they may have changed over the course of discussion. And then everyone on the panel will score. It's important to remember that only those 3 people actually read your application. Everybody else is just scoring you based on what they were told by the reviewers. They'll talk about sort of administrative issues that don't play into the score, and then they move on, and that whole process takes like 15 minutes. So you've put like months into this, and it all culminates in a 15-minute discussion in a review panel. It's important to understand sort of who the people are who are reading your application so that you know sort of the audience that you're writing to. And one way that you can figure out who that might be is using this tool called the assisted referral tool. You basically will put in your aims page. It'll match it to the study sections that it's most likely that your application would be reviewed by. And then you can click on the names of the review groups. It'll take you to a page that will tell you sort of the scope of that review group's work, who are the current assigned reviewers on that panel, so you kind of know exactly what your audience is, and that can be really helpful, I think. So you also want to think about like what are reviewers like, and I think that this is sort of what everybody thinks about when they think of reviewers. They're just going in there ready to just rip your application to shreds. But really, reviewers are scientists just like you. But it's really important to understand that they're not the same kind of scientists that you are. I think a lot of times people think that the reviewers have the same expertise that they do and are going to understand all of the technical detail that you're going to put in there. And the reality is that that's just not the case. They probably have a broad understanding of the kind of work that you do, but they're certainly not going to be a specialist, and you don't want to be writing something that only a specialist can understand. People also, I think that reviewers are out to get them, right? But really, they're working hard to give your application a fair review. But it is their job to be critical, and they're there to find the flaws in your application and point them out. It's important to remember, too, that they are people like you. So they have their job, their family, they go to work all day, they come home, they put their children to bed. It's like 10 o'clock, they're finally getting to a moment to themselves, and they sit down and they open up your application. And so when you're writing your application, think about, like, what would you want to read at 10 o'clock at night after all of those things? You would not want to read, open it up and see, like, a wall of text that's very technical, right? You want something that's going to be easy to get through. So that's really, I think, important to think about. I forgot I had a bullet for that. So remember them when you're writing your application. Okay, so we'll talk now about some of the other parts of the application. So the specific aims is really, I think, the most important part of your application. So remember that 3 reviewers on the panel read your whole application, and most of the other people who are giving you a score are only going to read this specific aims page. It's also the first page that the assigned reviewers are going to read. And so if you lose them in the specific aims page, like, you have lost them for the rest of the application. It's really hard to get excited about reading 12 more pages about the research that you're doing if, like, they did not get it on the first page. So you should work really hard on making sure that your specific aims page is clear. Here's kind of how I think about structuring a specific aims page. So the first sort of paragraph of text you're going to be talking about sort of what is the current state of the field, like what is the challenge that you're interested in, and why is it so important that someone solves this problem? Like, what are we not able to do or understand? And then a paragraph that talks about sort of more your specific hypothesis. What is it that you are proposing? What do you think? What are you proposing to do to solve that problem? How is what you're going to do different from what other people have done? And then when you solve the problem, like, what is the impact of that going to be? And then you'll lay out your 3 specific aims usually, where you say, this is the aim, this is the goal of the aim, this is a little bit about how I'm going to do it, this is a little bit about how I expect the outcome to be. That all needs to fit in one page, and you don't want it to be one page of solid text. So one concise page. But this is sort of roughly how to think about it. You also should talk to people like me, program officers, early and often before you submit your grant application, because I can help you before you submit. I can help you figure out whether what you're proposing is a good fit for my institute, and if it's not, I'll give you ideas about where you should go instead. If you're applying to some specific funding announcement, I can tell you whether it's the right thing for that or whether there's something else that would be more appropriate. I can talk to you about the review groups. Where is this likely to go? And then I listen to those all the time, right? So I can tell you, well, I know that this particular study section is really hot on X, Y, or Z, and you want to make absolutely sure that you cover that in the text of your application. So it's really a good idea to reach out to program officers before you submit your application. Some tips for doing that in an effective way. So don't ever cold call the program officer. I actually don't answer my phone because what am I going to do to help you? I don't know what your application is. I don't know what you're asking me about. So the best thing to do is to email them, send them your specific aims. When they don't email you back because they get 8 million emails a day and maybe they're not very organized and they lose track of your email them again, because it's our job to help you, and we're really happy to do it. Make sure you include that draft specific aims, because that gives me something to look at ahead of time so I know what we're going to be talking about. And then you can set up a time to have a call or a Zoom. I actually love that we all use Zoom now, because I can talk to you and look at you and have a conversation about your aims. Okay, so then you're going to be writing your research strategy. So this is really the bulk of the writing that you do in the application. And this is where you really go into a lot more detail about what you're planning to do and why they should care. So make sure that you talk about the significance of it. Like, why are you doing it? Why is it important? Innovation, how is it very different from what has been done? Or how is it better from what is currently exists? And then the approach, this is where you really want to go into detail about how you're going to do it, why you think the way that you're proposing to do it is going to work. You want to introduce your aims. You want to give the rationale for the experimental design that you propose. You want to show some preliminary data that's going to convince them that it's actually feasible. You're going to talk about how you're going to do it in sort of detail, and talk about the expected outcomes, and also really important, talk about what you're going to do if you were wrong. So like, what if your hypothesis wasn't correct? What if it doesn't work out the way that you anticipated? What are you going to do instead to make sure that you actually still get something out of the project? There is, in every funding announcement, a section of it that talks about the review criteria. So this tells you exactly what the reviewers are going to be looking for, and you want to make sure that all of those things are just served up to them really clearly in your application. These are the current review criteria, but that is actually changing. If you go to that site, you can read about the changes to the review framework. But the important thing to know is that any funding announcement, it's going to be clearly spelled out in the bottom, so you should always check that. And then another thing that is really helpful is sort of thinking about developing a template that's going to help you write grants. So I give a lot of these grant writing workshops with Tim Reddy. He uses this template that he put on his website so that people could use it, but it helps him sort of organize his thoughts, make sure that he covers all of the things that he means to cover and doesn't skip anything. And as you start writing more grants, you may have sort of a similar template that starts to develop. It's a great way to sort of keep yourself organized. The bio sketches we'll touch on briefly. So this is where you're talking about who wants to do this. Why are you the right person to do it? All of the PIs for the application and anybody else in any sort of key named role will have a bio sketch. You're going to talk about why you're the right person for this job. You want to highlight the publications that are relevant to the work that you're proposing so that the reviewers know what your sort of background is. And your same thing with your contributions to the field. What are really key to the proposal that you're putting forward? It's really important to think about the roles that you give people who you're working with. So a lot of junior investigators especially like to write grant applications with more senior investigators. But you have to be careful that you are thinking about the role that they're supposed to be in. So ask yourself really, like, how involved does this person need to be? How big is their role, and like how important is it that they're involved at a really substantial level? You want the reviewers to look at it and understand that that person cares enough about it so that if you can't do the work without them, that they actually think that they're invested in it, right? You also have to think really carefully about it if you have ESI status. So ESI status means that you finished your last research degree within the last 10 years and you've never gotten a major NIH grant of like the level of an R01. And the reason that this is important is because your application will be flagged as an application from an early stage investigator. In a review panel, they get clustered together, so they're reviewing your application along with other junior investigators and not like right after the leader in your field who's had like 25 years of sustained funding and a ton of preliminary data. And they're also evaluating your application in the context of your sort of career stage, so they're not expecting you to have all that preliminary data necessarily. Also, some institutes might have things like a separate pay line for early stage investigators or specific funding announcements for them. We have one at NHGRI. I actually on Monday presented a concept at our council to renew that program. It's only open to early stage investigators. So those are some of the reasons. And if you have, in order for your application to receive all these special benefits, all the PIs have to be early stage investigators. So you don't want to have a co-PI who's a more senior investigator. I'm going to skip this one because I think I don't have much time, but if you have questions about the budget, you can talk to me about that later. I also wanted to talk about some of the common issues in review that I see. So like the significance is a big one. If you haven't really convinced the reviewers that what you're proposing to do is significant or important, they're just not going to care so much. Also, if you are developing like a technology or a method and you're telling them that it's better, you better make sure that you're also telling them how you're going to demonstrate that what you're doing is better, so like validating it and benchmarking it against other methods. I talked earlier about being overly ambitious, so you're not going to be able to solve the entire field in the context of one grant, so don't try, like be very focused. Or it's too incremental. We hear that a lot. Even though you can't solve the entire field right away, like you do want to move it forward more than just like a little bit, right? And then interdependency and aims, people do that a lot too. You want to make sure that your aims don't depend on one of them working, because if one of them doesn't work and you have nothing else that you can do for the rest of the grant, that doesn't put you in a great place. So they have to sort of be complementary but independent. We talked already about validating, so you have to make sure that you're showing why what you're doing is an actual improvement over existing methods. Too optimistic, so you didn't adequately talk about how what you're proposing might not work, or you might be wrong, and what you would do instead. Reviewers really want to see that you've thought through that and that you've discussed it in the application. And then too dense, like I said, you don't want to read a block of very technical text and in the evening after you're tired, right? So make sure that you're writing your application for sort of a general audience, that everybody can understand why what you're proposing to do is important and needed, and why what you're doing is the right way to do it, right? Everybody should be able to get that. How do you avoid making mistakes like that? It's a really great idea to have other people that you work with read your specific aims and maybe your research strategy before you submit your application. And it doesn't have to be people who are in your field. Again, remember, the people who are reviewing your grant are not necessarily going to be specialists either. So you want to make sure that even people who are not can understand what you're doing and why. And also make sure you give them enough time. Everyone's busy. So you have to really start working back from the due date to make sure that you have enough time to get feedback on your aims and your strategy. Okay, so then I kind of skipped over step 5, because that's the boring step. You wait forever between when you submit your grant application and you get your score back. But you know, at the end of it, your grant is either going to get funded or not funded. So what do you do if you've listened to everything that I've told you today and you still don't get your grant funded? This is another depressing grant from the NIH data book. So the blue lines are the number of applications at a given percentile, which is on the bottom axis, that got funded, and the yellow lines are the ones that didn't get funded. This is across the NIH, but you can see that the majority of applications are not getting funded. You are probably pretty much like everybody else, right? So you're probably not going to get funded, especially not the first time. And it's important to know what to do next. So you're going to go through some stages of grief. It's very similar to other stages of grief you might go through. You're first going to be really mad, and that's okay, because obviously the reviewers were stupid and they can't read, they don't know anything, right? That's very clear. And then you're going to go through denial, where you're like, I'm just going to not look at it, and then it doesn't exist. Eventually, you're going to accept what you've got in your summary statement, and hopefully at that time you're going to think about reaching out to your program officer. The person who's the program officer is going to be listed at the top of your summary statement, so you'll know who to contact. And then you're going to call me and you're going to be like, are you sure it's not going to get funded? Like, what if I wrote a letter to council? And I'll talk you through that. I'm like a therapist. That's part of my job too. And then finally, hopefully you come to acceptance and you revise and resubmit. In most cases, I'm going to encourage you to revise and resubmit. You're definitely not going to get your grant funded if you don't submit it again, right? So that's a great thing to do. And then when you call me to talk about your summary statement afterwards, I can help you understand what were really the major issues that drove the score. So I did not write your grant. It's not my baby. Like, I don't care about it the way that you do. And I have a very different perspective on what went on in the study section than you might. I talk to people and they get really mad about like one thing that the reviewer said in there, and they can't focus on anything else. But a lot of times that wasn't important. It's not the thing that drove the score. And so I can help you sort of decide what are the important things that you need to focus on when you revise and resubmit. I can also help you figure out which things are fixable and which things aren't. Sometimes if the reviewers really just are not interested in what you're proposing, then maybe it is time for you to step back and think about sort of reworking it substantially. But a lot of times it's just about better grant writing, being more clear, like giving a little bit more information than you gave. And I can also talk to you about the outlook for funding. I will be honest with you if I think that there's a chance for funding or I think that there's not a chance for funding, and I'll help you sort of work through sort of what to do next. So this is the last slide, and then I'll take questions. Most, if not all, of the various websites and resources that I mentioned in this talk are linked on this page, so you didn't have to catch every QR code through this entire talk. And I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Chadwick. Before the next question, folks come up to the mic, or we can pass the mic back. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How can people get experience serving on a study section?
Yeah, so I think it's actually really great if you can. You do have to have a faculty position to get on a study section, but you don't have to have a grant necessarily yet. So the Center for Scientific Review that puts together all of those review panels, they have a program called the Early Career Reviewer Program. There's a link to that on this site. And you basically register, you tell them sort of what your background is, what your expertise is, and then they can help match you to a study section. So if you get through that, you'll get put on a study section with a really reduced load. You'll only have like 3 applications and everyone else will have like 8 or 9, right? But you'll get to go and participate in the study section. And when I talk to people who have served on a review panel for the first time, they're like, oh, now I see, right? Like it really gives you a whole different perspective on it. And I think it will change the way that you write your application. So it's a great idea to get some review service if you can. A lot of your institutions, I hope, also do things like have mock study sections. So I think all of those things could be really helpful.
Or there's multiple.
Hi, I was wondering, does it happen that there are certain reviewers that will consistently score the grants very low or very high? And if it's, it may happen. And do you have a way to monitor that and then correcting that?
So I'm not a review officer, so I don't run the review panel. But the thing about a study section is you have 3 reviewers that have read it, right? And so sometimes they all agree, right? Sometimes they're all pretty consistent. They all know it's fuchsia. Or sometimes they're very divergent and one person is off. But they still have to go and like talk about it, right? So they have to tell everyone why they think that why they gave it the score that they did. And they're not all going to agree about that, and that's okay. But that's part of review. So then when you get your summary statement back and you see these negative comments, then that's when you call your program officer, and then I can help you sort of figure out like what to do next with that. If you're consistently getting, though, bad scores for similar sorts of things, then I tell people that might be a you problem, right? Like that's telling you that you're not doing a good enough job of explaining what you're doing. So learn from that too, right? Listen to what they're telling you.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just follow up quickly?
Yeah, of course.
So I'm saying that because I know someone who was at NEI study section, and then we have in the eye, there's the front of the eye and the back of the eye. And those are two different worlds. And the person told me that he sees, being on the study section, that people from one part of the eye score grants a little bit better than the other part of the eye. So that's why I was wondering, is there like a way to correct that? Because it seemed in his view that was systematic.
No, and that's the reality of study section. And that is, I think, sort of getting at that, what I was saying, that like not everyone on the study section cares about the same thing that you do. And it's really your job to explain to everyone, even if this isn't the thing that they care the most about, why what you're doing is also important, right? You just have to go into it knowing that everyone on that study section doesn't have the same priorities that you do. And you've got to convince them why what you're doing is the right thing to do.
Yeah,
and also just remember to introduce yourself before the questions.
Very informative talk. I'm Priyanka Bajaj, a postdoc at UCSF. So my question is, I was reading about NIH grants, and there is an eligibility criteria of being completing the RCR course, which is Responsible Conduct of Research.
Yeah.
So if we are allowed to resubmit our application, do we need to have completed the course by the first time we have submitted, or we can complete it once we have revised and resubmitted, and later if it gets accepted, by that time we need to have a completed course?
Yeah, so that is something that is more specific to fellowship applications, which I don't do a ton of looking at summary statements myself. But my understanding is that you also have to submit that as part of your just-in-time information. So just-in-time is like after you get your score and we're making decisions about what grants we're going to fund or not fund, we're also going to ask you to, like, hey, can you give us all of your last-minute updates? Like, did you get any grants funded? Do you have any changes in the funding that you're receiving? And have you done that? So I think that you can probably submit those updates as part of your just-in-time. But all of the fellowship applications also have a specific program officer that works with applicants, and I would contact the person who is the fellowship coordinator, and they can for sure help you with that question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Evgeny Ivakin, Hospital for Sick Kids, Toronto, Canada. I just wonder if you're getting application from outside of the US. How is it being evaluated?
Yeah, so it depends on the funding announcement. So in each funding announcement, there's a section that tells you exactly who can and cannot apply. And if a foreign institution can apply, it'll say it there. Or if a foreign component of like a subcontract of a grant that was from an American institution. But a lot of them you can. And the things that we're looking for are like, is it something that like really you're the person who can do it and nobody else in the United States could do it? There is a second level of review. They do also then get reviewed by our council as well, and we have to make those justifications, and the council has to agree that it's that there's a reason to fund a grant from another country. But we do that for sure.
Jacob Kitzman, Michigan. Great talk. Thanks. I'm wondering, what can you tell me about nosies?
Oh,
Because I've hit nosies and I'm not sure what
I left that out because I hate saying nosies. So NOSI stands for a Notice of Special Interest. That is really means very little, right? So it's just us telling you like, hey, we like this topic. NHGRI has some nosies out that are for like, just to remind you that we do like genomic technology development, which is like one of the major kinds of areas of science that we fund. We also have a nosy out there. But the reviewers do not know that you're responding to a nosy. They don't see anything about that. It's really just sort of an internal tracking system. So unless there's something specific, you don't have to worry too much about nosies. Nosies also are actually being like, you're actually applying through one of those funding announcements, right? So they point to another funding announcement as well. So they're really just sort of a tracking thing.
Hi, Lisa. I'm Dustin Baldridge from WashU in St. Louis. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question I'm scared to ask, at least in this venue.
You don't have to be.
Okay, great. And in fact, you and I may have discussed this other times. So can you talk a little bit about NHGRI perspective, wearing your program officer hat, about deep mutational scanning of like just a single or handful of genes and whether that fits within NHGRI portfolio or not?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So I wish I had like a slide that I've seen my division director, Carolyn, use before, where she shows like the amount of funding that all of the institutes of the NIH get and how much of that we get. And we are actually like, sometimes we like to think of ourselves as a medium-sized institute, but we're like a medium to small kind of institute. Most genomics research that goes on at the NIH is funded by other institutes. And we do a lot of sort of the methods development, really generalizable stuff. So developing ways to do deep mutational scanning better or improve it or analyze it or whatever, that's kind of in the scope of NHGRI. But if you're interested in specific genes, that's when you want to start thinking about those sort of disease-specific institutes and applying there. And I would definitely recommend talking to program staff at those institutes to make sure that that's what they're interested in, and focus yourself in maybe on a couple genes that are related to each other and like they're all similar phenotypes or same organ system or something, so that you're sure that that institute is going to care about it.
Any other questions, or maybe we'll go right into break then. Thank you so much, Dr. Chadwick.
Great.